Good evening. Thank you very much for joining our fourth webinar presented by one of AsiaEdit's managing editors. Today we're going to be looking at journal selection, where you can publish, and I'll let Leo talk about that in a little while. My name is Nick Case, and I'm one of the founders of AsiaEdit. We were set up just before the handover, 1996. And since then, we've been helping academics get published in journals. And also one of our major roles, especially around this time of the year, is helping with government research fund proposals as well. Just put that in as a bit of a promotion. So today we have Leo Holroyd presenting. Leo's been working with originally Armstrong Hilton, now AsiaEdit, for the last 5 years, when he started off as a freelance editor, covering chemistry and other allied subjects. And in 2019, he stepped up to the role of managing editor for physical sciences. And now he has a growing team of physical scientist editors whom he looks after, provides training for, and guidance as they come across difficult papers or issues they wish to address when editing papers. Originally, Leo got his master's. He attained his master's in chemistry from the University College London, and later his PhD in chemistry from the University of St Andrews. He has been published in multiple publications where his research into biological molecules has been expanded upon. Just before I hand over to Leo, if you do have any questions as his presentation goes on, please drop them in the chat box. So I've got a record of them there, and I can raise those questions for him either as we go through the presentation or at the end, depending on when it's more pertinent. And I think that's it. Yes. So if I can hand over to Leo. Leo.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everybody for coming today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the rather thorny issue of journal selection, choosing who you should submit your research to for publication. So let's get going. The first thing to say is congratulations. If you're here, that means you've completed some research or you're about to complete research and you want to have it published. You'll have spent months or probably years on your research. You'll have thought about it, planned it, then done it, and finally written it up, or you'll be in the last stages of writing it up now. The only problem is no one knows about it yet. So you need to publish, you need to get the word of your research out there, but where do you publish? Where can you publish and where should you? So let's think about the size of the problem. How many scientific journals are there? There are several estimates online, and they're all in a similar range. University World News thinks there are at least 30,000. You can find 28,000 results on the EDANS journal selector, and about 25,000 on the Web of Science resource. Now that may seem like a huge number. Not all of these are likely to still be active today. Some will be defunct. Some will be very small journals that only publish a few articles per year. Some of those are probably duplicate results. But nonetheless, it's clear that there is a huge number of academic journals. So you have a big choice to make. So what about your field in particular? Well, let's take one example. Imagine you had a paper on fluid mechanics, a very widely researched subject. Just thinking of papers with journals with fluid mechanics in the title. Your options would include the Journal of Fluid Mechanics, Journal of Experiments in Fluid Mechanics, Fluid Dynamics Research, the Annual Review of Fluid Mechanics, if your work was a review. And those are all published by different publishers around the world. And that wouldn't be it, because any general physics or engineering journal would probably have a section devoted to fluid mechanics as well. So you'd have a choice of more than 4 journals from which to choose. So how can you distinguish one from the other? Well, let's think about 3 different approaches to journal selection. First of all, scope, and that means to whom is your work most relevant? What is the range of researchers who will show an interest in your work? And that can mean in terms of which field they're in, or geographically, where are they located, and so forth. Secondly, what is the impact factor of different journals? You'll all have heard of impact factors. You'll know that that's a way that the importance of journals is ranked. But what does it mean? And what does the impact factor mean for your choice of journal? An impact factor being a measure of how often work is likely to be cited after it's published. And the third way we can think about this is open access. Open access, something that's taken off quite recently in academic publishing and is starting to revolutionize things. And that means, is your work going to be freely available? An open access paper can be seen by anyone without paying a fee, but that often implies that you'll have to pay a fee for that to be possible. So does your work need to be freely available? And if so, what are the options and what are the fees? So let's think about scope. There are several different aspects of scope, and we can start with significance. How important is your research to your field? It could be an incremental contribution. That means you've built on work that's gone before, you've applied a particular method or theory to another problem, and so you've built upon existing knowledge. Or more rarely, you may have made a more fundamental advance. You may have shown by experiment or by theory that a particular problem in your field needs to be seen in a different way, and you've moved your field on conceptually, which would make the work more important. Now, this isn't about the quality of your work per se. Incremental work can be very high quality, but it does reflect well, it requires you to think about the importance of your work to the field more generally, and even to people outside of your field. Scope also covers geographic reach in some subjects. It won't apply everywhere. If you do something like theoretical physics or chemistry, that tends to be fairly global. It's the same the world over. But many other fields in physical science are linked to a particular part of the world, geology or urban studies or climatology. And the results from a particular case study in one region may or may not be relevant more globally to researchers in other regions. Similarly, if you've developed a new technology or a new industrial process, it might be applicable worldwide, or there might be some limitations there, and that's something you need to think about. And simply the length of your research as well. Typical research articles would be over 4,000 words, but another option, if you can condense your research into a shorter format, you might think about publishing not as a full-length article, but as a letter, also known as a communication. And that's an interesting alternative option that I'll talk about. So let's focus more on significance. Now, the website for every journal, when you're browsing through the different journals available, every website should have an aims and scope page. It will be called that or something very similar. And that lays out the editorial standards of the journal, the kinds of criteria that an article needs to meet to be published in that journal. So I'm going to compare the aims and scope of 4 different journals in a particular field. And I've chosen the field of medicinal chemistry. Let's suppose you have a medicinal chemistry paper. You might think about submitting to Nature. You'll probably all be aware that Nature is one of the most prestigious scientific journals. By the way, I put I'm going to show you the impact factor for each journal here. I will go into more detail later about what that means. So you'll be aware of Nature. It describes itself as publishing journals of outstanding scientific importance. It publishes less than 10% of the submitted articles. And that's from an already fairly self-selecting group of authors, because you wouldn't submit to Nature in the first place unless you were very confident in the quality of your research. Now, many chemists will also have heard of Journal of the American Chemical Society. Moving down just slightly, it's a specific chemistry journal, but it's pretty much ranked as one of the top chemistry journals. And it describes itself as providing research essential to the field of chemistry. And again, that wording essential implies that we're dealing here with the highest not the highest quality, but the highest impact of research. And that's reflected in an impact factor of 15, which is still relatively high. Now, moving into field-specific journals, which tend to have lower impact factors than the top general journals, your medicinal chemistry paper might be published in the European Journal of Medicinal Chemistry. And if we look at the aims and scope for this journal, the wording is a bit more general. Studies on the main aspects of medicinal chemistry, a medium for original research, but there's nothing suggesting that the work has to be excellent or outstanding. And a similar example, but with a smaller impact factor and an even more broad description of what can be accepted: future medicinal chemistry, unsolicited content, reviews, research or commentaries, keeping readers up to date. It's fairly vague language, and that signals that this is a journal with more accommodating editorial standards than the top journals like Nature or the others shown here. So these...
Yeah, sorry, Leo. I mean, you've got there, I mean, with Nature, so you said Nature publishes 8% of submissions. Would you have any statistics for what percentage of submissions are published for the other journals offhand?
Not specifically for those ones. Not many journals actually publish that information, I found. It is something I've looked into before, and it's quite hard to find. So no, I can't give you specific numbers.
But they're generally going to be much higher take up anyway.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So, all right then. So thanks, Nick. So the keywords there from the aims and scope page give you a clue as to how optimistic you have to be to submit your research to that journal. So the geography aspect of aims and scope, this won't apply to all researchers, but it will apply to many. So just quickly, a couple of examples I picked of journals in subjects that are region specific, but which state that any journal, any paper that they accept should have a more broad application than just the region in which it was conducted. First of these, American mineralogist. If you do a mineralogy study, it will probably be carried out in a particular area, but it won't be published in this journal unless it's the research implications are broader than simply the area in which it was carried out. And likewise, if your study is in ecology, you shouldn't think about submitting to the Journal of Ecology, which is a UK journal, unless the importance of your research transcends the limits of any particular case study. So if your research is region specific, you need to think about how applicable it will be, how relevant it will be to people in different parts of the world. And just as a historical note on what can happen if your research is published in a journal that's too limited in scope, some of you may have heard of Gregor Mendel, known as the father of genetics, and in the 19th century, he carried out experiments that pretty much laid the foundations for the modern field of genetics. Some of the most important research ever carried out. In 1866, he submitted this to the Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brunn, a rather obscure journal in his home country, his hometown, now in the Czech Republic, which was not widely read and was missed by Charles Darwin, who was active at the same time in the UK. And if Darwin had seen Mendel's results at the time, he would have recognized their significance. And the modern form of evolutionary theory and genetics would have been developed decades earlier than it was, with huge implications for the history of science. I don't know, impact factors were not a thing in 1866, so I don't know what the impact factor of that journal would have been, but it would have been very low.
I mean, I guess he was applying in German, right? So perhaps had he applied to a UK journal, they may not have heard of him. They might have sidelined his research. I'm defending him here for maybe not getting into a journal he might have benefited from. But I guess there might be other political reasons why he was unable to get into a more respectable journal.
Yes, I mean, he might not have been published in a UK journal at the time. I'm not aware of whether he spoke English or not, but they would have been leading German language journals at the time. I think German was the language of science at that time.
That's true. Yes. Yes.
So I think he could have done better than that. I'm not entirely sure why he ended up in such a famously obscure journal.
Right. He aimed too low anyway.
He did. He definitely did. So looking at the final aspect of scope, which is length, this is a simple one. The longest forms of articles are review articles, literature reviews. Typically, these are published by invitation from the journal only, so journal selection normally isn't an issue there. The majority of research is published in the form of full-length articles, generally over 4,000 words or so. And this will often be the product of years of work. But another option, if you can condense your research into a shorter format, is to publish as a letter or a communication. And many journals specialize in this form of article. For example, chemical physics letters, where I've published a couple of times. And I find that from my own experience, that can be a useful way of maximizing the clarity of a piece of research. Sometimes your first draft of a work, it may be too long, it may be a little bit unclear exactly what your point is. And in my own experience, I submitted one paper as a full-length article to a journal. It was rejected quite roundly, but I was able to work out why it was rejected and condense it down to a much shorter paper that was published eventually as a letter, which was actually much clearer. And in that way, I was able to improve my own research by rewriting and shortening it in that way. And short does not mean trivial. The journals that publish letters typically focus on urgent work that deserves to be published as soon as possible, and letters can be highly cited. My own most cited paper from my very short bibliography was published as a letter. So having compared the different types of scope that you need to take into consideration, something that's related but different is the impact factor of journals. Now, you'll have all heard of impact factor, but just as a reminder, what actually is it? For a particular journal, the impact factor is simply the number of times that articles published in the last 2 years were cited this year, the combined number of citations, divided by the total number of publications in the last 2 years. So that gives you an estimate, well, an average number of citations that a paper in this journal can be expected to have in its first 2 years after publication. So on average, if you publish in a journal with a higher impact factor, you can expect to get more citations in the first 2 years. And that much is a fact. That's something that is definitely true. By definition, the impact papers in high impact journals are more likely to be cited. But apart from facts, there's also a lot of subjective opinions and stereotypes about what impact factor actually means. Journals with a higher impact factor are more prestigious, so you might believe that papers in high impact journals are more important or impressive or better, but that's not necessarily true. That is just an opinion. And to give you an idea of the range of impact factors, the very top journals have impact factors of around 40. For example, the so-called CNS journals, Cell, Nature and Science. They are 3 of the most prestigious, or probably the 3 most prestigious journals in physics and, in chemistry and biology. And for the lowest impact factors, they can be below 1. So as I mentioned, there are some caveats, there are some limitations to how we can interpret impact factors. Just as a reminder, or to set the context, impact factors were not originally devised as a way of evaluating anybody's research. They were invented as a way to help librarians with limited budgets choose which journals they should purchase for their library. That was in 1975. Since then, they have rather taken on a life of their own. They've become a major influence on how academia works and how publishing works. And they're often taken as though they were a measure of a study's quality. If you publish in a high impact journal, it's said that your research is of a higher quality, but this is not strictly the case. All an impact factor measures is the average number of citations of recent papers in a given journal. It doesn't say anything about any specific publication. And I think it's true, I certainly hope it's true, that truly important work will always be cited regardless of where it's published. If your work is good, it will be recognized by others in the field, regardless of which journal you publish in. And if you want to know more about some of the formal criticisms that have been leveled at the overuse of impact factors, you can see the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which is signed by many academics. And a third way that we can look at the journal selection problem is in terms of open access. Now, like impact factor, this is something that's become increasingly important in recent years. And an open access simply means that, unlike in the traditional subscription model, where anyone who wants to read your research has to pay either for that article or for the journal as a whole, open access research is free for everyone to look at as soon as it's published. Now, true open access, also known as gold open access, means what I just said, that the article is immediately available to everyone free of charge. And this almost always means that the author of that work has to pay a publication fee. If you want your work to be freely available to researchers all around the world, you'll almost always have to pay a fee to the journal. There are other levels of open access, shades of open access. One of them is known as green. If a green open access journal publishes its own papers behind a paywall, that means that any academic who wants to download the official version still has to pay a fee, but allows the author to privately host their own work as well. So you don't pay to publish, but you are allowed to host your own work on your own website if you would like to. The journal effectively waives its copyright on the work. And there's also hybrid. Hybrid is, I think, probably the most common type of open access. A hybrid open access journal is one that gives you the choice. You can either pay for your work to be open access, as though it were gold, or you can choose not to pay the fee, and then the article will be behind a paywall, as in the traditional subscription model. And if you go to the website of a hybrid open access journal and look through the list of recent publications, you'll see that some of them can be freely downloaded. That means the authors are paid for gold open access, and others will have a little symbol showing that you need to pay a fee for that article. And in the absence of any kind of open access, you have the traditional subscription model, where the author doesn't pay a penny to publish, but anyone else who wants to read the article has to pay for it.
So basically, open access has only been possible because of the internet. I mean, they don't circulate free journals, for example. There's no separate journal. There's no one journal which is non-open access and another version which has suddenly got open access articles, for example. It's just accessible through the internet. Is that right?
No, that's quite right. Yeah, it's something that's made possible by technology. Right. Basically, I mean, in publishing in the old days was a sort of resource-limited business model, in that you have to publish these things on paper and send them out. And now with the internet, that's completely sort of upset the foundations of how publishing works, because what you're publishing is just text and images that can in principle be made available to everyone everywhere. So the whole publishing industry is sort of catching up with that, and open access is, I think, one sort of compromise between the needs of publishers to make a profit and the fact that researchers need to have their work as freely available as possible.
Fair enough. Okay, fees. This is what I wondered if you're going to cover this. So yes, I guess this is the important part of open access, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, I've been talking about fees, but how much do you actually pay to have your work published open access? Well, it varies quite widely. It depends on the journal and on the open access type. Excuse me. But for gold only open access journals, those fees can be as little as $500, or they can range to at least $3,000 per article. And that's a fee that you'll either be paying personally from your own research fund, or possibly from your institution's fund. Hybrid open access journals have a wider range of fees. They can be very low, but some hybrid journals are among the most prestigious in their field, and they can charge as much as $10,000 per paper if you want open access. And an example there is Cell, which I mentioned earlier, one of the most prestigious journals in biology. You'll be paying almost $10,000 per article to publish open access in Cell. Now, those are the fees as stated on the website, but that's not necessarily the amount that you'd have to pay. It's always worth checking if your institution has an agreement with any particular publisher to waive open access fees. That's something that does happen. Some publishers offer help to authors from specific countries to get their work published. And also, well, I've covered that your institution may have a particular agreement with publishers. Even if they don't waive those fees, they may be reduced. So the amount that you need to pay may be slightly lower than those quoted here, but there's no doubt that it can be a significant expense, and you need to decide how important it is for your work to be widely available, freely available, and that comes back to impact. If your work is going to be of interest to researchers beyond your field, then that in such a case, it might be worth paying this fee for open access. So having gone over all the different aspects that you need to consider, let's think about possible approaches to the question of journal selection. Now, if you are confident that the work you've done is especially important and might make a fundamental advance to your field, you can always start high and move down. High in terms of the importance or the prestige of the journal, which you could measure by impact factor, or you could go by reputation. And if your first attempt is a failure, if your first journal does not accept your paper, you can then try another one and keep moving down until you reach acceptance. I can advise you from my own experience that it's wise to be realistic about the importance of your research. I've had one experience where we started very high with a piece of with a particular project that probably didn't merit publication in a top journal, and we had to move down. I think we had to go through about 3 or 4 rejections to a much lower impact publication until we reached acceptance. So do be realistic.
I think it's very difficult. If someone, for most of our clients, they do feel that their research is cutting edge, and therefore they tend to, perhaps there's a tendency to pitch yourself a bit higher than you might. As you said, being realistic, it can be a bit difficult. It can be a bit tricky.
Yeah. I mean, we started too high. As soon as I heard the name of the journal that we were going to submit to first time round, I just thought, well, that's not going to happen.
I see. Okay. One of your co-authors was much more optimistic than you.
I think one of my co-authors was under pressure in their own career trajectory to publish in a high impact journal, and that's part of the problem, really, which the fact that academics are under pressure to publish in high impact journals in order to for reasons such as personal prestige or to secure funding, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And the impact factors of journals are used as a metric, almost to measure the quality of researchers, which isn't what the impact factor was designed for, as I've gone over.
Yes. So
if you don't want to try your luck with that approach, another strategy is if you're building on your earlier work, if your research applies similar methods to work that you've previously had successfully published, then it can be worth starting with the journals that you've previously published in, because your work should be of an appropriate scope for those journals. Or alternatively, you may be aware of rivals or collaborators in your field, and you could try to find where their most cited papers are published. If you go to the URL of any published paper, it will tell you how many citations that particular paper has received. In that way, you can bypass the impact factor, which is a journal average, and you can find out how many times a particular piece of research has been cited. And if something that you know to be an important paper in your field has been published in a particular journal, then that might be a good place for you to start.
How about I guess also maybe looking at where your papers have been cited is another way of, if someone has picked up on your previous papers, then if you track where you've been cited, that would give you some indication of where interest lies.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, because I suppose that comes down to, you might wonder, has this been highly cited because it was better, or maybe does this journal have a wider readership, or did we publish open access? I suppose open access papers are always going to be more highly cited because they're more widely available.
Yes.
So to sum it up, remember that the most important aim that we want to achieve with journal selection is that you want your work to be seen by the widest possible audience, given two constrictions. Firstly, the scope of your research, how important it is to your field and to allied fields, and the editorial policies or standards of the journals, what requirements they place on the impact of work to be published. But if we follow the strategies and bear in mind some of the aspects that I've talked about, hopefully that should help you to achieve this and to navigate your way through the rather thorny field of journal selection. So that pretty much sums it up. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I think Nick is going to pass on any questions that you send about what we've just gone over, about journal selection or the perils of getting your work published in the sciences.
Thank you, Leo. So yes, if I throw it to the floor, do any of you have any questions that you'd like to bring forward? I mean, I recall when some research I did back in the 90s, which was on the, I mean, I'm not a chemist, so this was in business. It was on the Japanization of British industry. And I think I finished my research about 2 months before the Japanese bubble burst. So no one was going to publish anything I'd written, because as soon as I finished it, it was out of date.
Yeah.
I was just a bit behind the curve on that one, I think.
So that one had to go into a drawer, did it, and never be published?
I think it ended up on a university shelf somewhere. Yes, a couple of copies, and that was it.
Well, these days you could have hosted it for free, I suppose. Even if no one wanted to read it, you could have put it on.
Well, that's it. I mean, so you mentioned there open access. I guess that opens the door towards, we haven't discussed it here, but predatory journals, right? I mean, that's an area where we don't want to go down. And that people don't often know where that line is, do they? They're not sure. I mean, how can they tell if a journal, you're paying money for open access, you think, well, this is maybe the publicity around a journal can look really good. And you do a bit of research and think, oh, this sounds like a good journal, and I've only got to pay 500 US or whatever. You mentioned some of the lower numbers there. Taylor and Francis, it's a good publisher. And you think, oh, right, I have to pay this, and lots of people are going to have access to my research. How would you know if where you're being published is somewhere you don't want to be published?
Yeah, well, people do keep lists. I think there's one, I don't remember the name, but there's one man who's pretty much making it his life's work to keep track of predatory journals and predatory conferences.
Right.
There is a very comprehensive list of those. As you say, the dividing line isn't always clear, but usually it is. Certainly, if you're being asked to pay, if you're being guaranteed publication, if you're being told that your fee guarantees publication, then that signals a predatory journal, because the normal way of doing things is you go with an open access journal, you go through the normal peer review process, and only once the paper's been accepted do you then pay a fee. The fee is not to guarantee publication. The fee is only for open access.
Right, to cover their costs.
Yeah, so predatory journals and predatory conferences are a very a growing problem, and probably something that we could do another webinar about. I think they're worth a whole webinar, because they are a growing trend, and increasingly, a peril to the research process.
Right, I see. Well, let's take a note and look at doing that in future. I've got no other I have no questions coming through at the moment. Everyone, you must have addressed everybody's concerns sufficiently in your presentation. Okay. All right, well, Leo, thank you very much. If those who have attended this evening and those also who watch this later on when we publish the video. If you do have any queries, then please reach out to us. You've got our website there, AsiaEdit.com, and also resources at AsiaEdit.com if you want to email us. And if you've got any queries, and we'll be very happy to get back to you and answer any issues that you might raise. We have some thanks for you, Leo, coming in from some of the participants. And thank you very much from me too. And I'll look forward to talking to you anon. Thanks very much for attending, everybody. And until our next webinar, take care.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone.